Hello, everybody. It's me, Mr. Wells, and we're here to read the next thing that we're going to do in our lit unit. We've been looking at the thrill of horror stories, scary stories. Been reading them, we've been reading about them, and I want you to get your notes out, your thrill of horror notes, because we're going to finish those notes today as we are reading what we're doing. Attached to this video in your Google Classroom, you should have a copy of an essay called "What is the Horror Genre" by Sharon A. Russell. Okay, and this essay is an example of what is called literary criticism. Literary criticism, and you can see on your notes that is a whole category there, and you can put the definition there on your notes. Literary criticism is writing that examines and analyzes and interprets a piece of literature or a general aspect of literature. So it's writing that examines, analyzes, and interprets a piece of literature or a general aspect of literature. So basically, what we're saying is that if you read a story, let's say when we read The Monkey's Paw, you read the story Monkey's Paw, but if you write then an essay about it that explains about it, tells what you think the lesson in the Monkey's Paw is, or writes about some of the elements that the author of the Monkey's Paw used in writing the story, then that would be literary criticism. We think when we think of criticism, we think of being mean or finding mistakes or something like that, and it can be that. But in this case, criticism can be good or bad. You're just sort of picking the writing apart to really understand it more. In that way, it's kind of similar to what we were doing in the last unit with close reading, where you're reading something to really analyze and understand it. But once you've done that and then you write about it, then that's called literary criticism. And it can be about a singular story, or the definition here says, or a general aspect of literature. So that means you could write about a whole genre. This is what romantic stories are like, and this is what they're trying to do to the reader, and this is what message they're trying to send. In this case, we're talking about horror stories or scary stories, and the message that they're trying to convey and the methods that they use to do that. So if you haven't, make sure you get in your notes that literary criticism is writing that examines, analyzes, and interprets a piece of literature or general aspect of literature. Okay, I'm going to start reading here, and you can read along with me on this essay. What is the horror genre? Many people define horror by its subjects. We all think of creatures like Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, and the Wolfman as monsters in the horror genre. Each one of these creatures has a history and developed over a period of time. But we also know that horror covers more than just these monsters. We could all make long lists of the kinds of creatures we identify with horror, especially when we think of films as well as literature. The minute we would start to make such a list, we would also realize that not all monsters are alike and that not all horror deals with monsters. The subject approach is not the clearest way to define this genre. Okay, so in this very first paragraph, Sharon Russell begins by setting her purpose for writing this. And an author's purpose is the author's reason for writing. So the purpose of a piece of writing is the author's reason for writing. And you can write that in your notes as well. Purpose is the author's reason for writing. And in this particular case, her reason for writing, as it is stated in the first paragraph, is to define the horror genre. What is the horror genre all about? Well, she brings up the idea of these monsters like werewolves, vampires, all those kinds of monsters we think about in horror. But she says, not all horror stories have those kind of monsters. And so that's not probably the best way to define what a horror story really is. And so now, if that's not the way we're going to define it, now she's going to try to tell us, okay, what is the way to define it? And that's the purpose of the story. Let's keep reading together. Some students of this genre find that the best way to examine it is to deal with the way horror fiction is organized or structured. Examining the organization of a horror story shows that it shares certain traits with other types of fiction. Horror stories share the use of suspense as a tactic with many other kinds of literature. The tension we face when a character goes into the attic, down into the basement, or just into an abandoned house is partially a result of suspense. We don't know what's going to happen, but that suspense is intensified by our knowledge of the genre. We know that characters involved in the world of horror always meet something awful when they go where they shouldn't. Part of the tension is created because they're doing something we know is going to get them in trouble. Stephen King refers directly to our anticipation of horror. In Salem's Lot, Susan approaches the house which is the source of evil. Quote, she found herself thinking of those drive-in horror movie epics where the heroine goes venturing up the narrow attic stairs or down into some dark, cobwebby cellar, and she thinking, I never do that. Of course, Susan's fears are justified. She does end up dead in the basement, a victim of the vampire. Okay, so what we've just read here, we can go through and, you read this big long paragraph that started with some students and goes all the way down to the end where it talks about Susan being a victim of a vampire. Sometimes it's really helpful when we're looking at things like this to summarize them. Okay, go back and reread it and say what ultimately does the author mean? What does the author mean? Okay, and that's what summarize is. Okay, you can write in your notes, summarize. Most of you know or have practiced summarizing before, but the definition of summarize is to briefly retell the central ideas and most important details in a piece of writing. Briefly retell central details, the central ideas and most important details in a piece of writing. Okay, so let's look at that and go back up there to where it starts with some students. And I want you just to take a minute. You can pause the video if you need to. Just take a minute and reread that paragraph. And after you've reread it, see if you can summarize it. How would you summarize it? Just in a sentence or two. What is this paragraph talking about? Go ahead and do that if you would. Okay, hopefully you just paused the video and reread that big long paragraph and you have summarized it. How did you summarize it? Well, if you could have said something very simple, something as simple as readers expect bad things to happen to the characters in a horror story. Readers expect bad things to happen to characters in the horror story. And we know that's the case. I don't know if you've ever watched a scary movie and you're sitting there and you're yelling even either in your mind or out loud, you're yelling at the character, do not go into that house. Do not go down into that basement. It's because because you're expecting something that bad is going to happen. So readers expect that something bad is going to happen because it's in the horror genre. Okay, so that would be summarizing. Summarize is to briefly retell the central ideas and most important details in a piece of writing. Let's keep going. We'll start if the horror. If the horror genre uses the character's search for information to create suspense, it controls when and where we get our knowledge. Because we're outside of the situation, we usually know more than the characters. Our advanced knowledge creates suspense because we can anticipate what's going to happen. The author can play with those expectations by either confirming them or surprising us with a different outcome. When suspense is an important element in fiction, we may often find that the plot is the most critical part of the story. We care more about what happens next than about who the characters are or where the story is set. But setting is often considered a part of the horror genre. If the genre has traditional monsters, it also has traditional settings. Only authors who want to challenge the tradition place events in bright, beautiful parks. We expect a connection between the setting and the events in the genre. We're not surprised to find old houses, abandoned castles, damp cellars, or dark forests as important elements in the horror story. Some people make further distinctions based on how the stories are organized. We can divide stories into different categories based on how we come to believe in the events related and how they're explained to us. Stories that deal with parallel worlds expect us to accept those worlds without question. We just believe Dorothy is in Oz. We accept Oz as a parallel world separate from ours. Other times, events seem to be supernatural, but turn out to have natural explanations. The ghosts turn out to be squirrels in the attic, or things that move mysteriously are part of a plot to drive someone crazy. Sometimes the supernatural is a result of the way the central character sees the world, as in stories told from the point of view of a crazy person. But at times we're not sure and hesitate about believing in the possibility of the supernatural. Okay, so when we look at this, Russell is trying to define what horror genre is. And in order to do that, she has to set up criteria to determine what the genre is. Okay, so criteria is your last definition on your notes here. Criteria is the standards used to define and classify literature. Okay, standards used to define and classify literature. Okay, so if you don't have two people in love, you don't have a romance story. It's a different type of story. And here she's saying there are certain things, the suspense, the traditional settings of dark forests, and that kind of thing. The parallel worlds that we just accept. You know that Dorothy can go to Oz. That there can be a different world, or that the supernatural, ghosts and goblins and all those things can exist. All these things are criteria. They're standards used to define what the horror genre is. Okay, so those are criteria, standards used to define and classify literature. Let's keep going. When I first read Dracula, I seriously considered hanging garlic on my windows because I believed that vampires could exist. Okay, notice here she uses personal pronouns here. She's talking about I. When I first read Dracula, I seriously considered hanging garlic on my windows. Okay, this is the first time that she's really gone into her own life, her own story, and the personal pronoun "I" really indicates what that is. What do you think the impact of that personal detail might be? Well, maybe it's that scary stories have really impacted her. They made an influence on her life, or when she was young, she really believed scary stories. She actually wanted to put the garlic up on her window to keep the vampires away. The story was a good enough story to draw her in, to make her view it, at least for a moment, as reality. And that's one of the things that makes a really good story, is when you yourself feel drawn in to that story. So she says, when I first read Dracula, I seriously considered hanging garlic on my windows because I believed that vampires could exist. This type of hesitation, when we almost believe, falls into the general category of the fantastic. Often horror has its greatest effect on us because we almost believe, or believe while we are reading the book or watching the film, that the events are possible. Yet another way of categorizing works of horror is by the source of the horror. Some horror comes from inside the characters. Something goes wrong inside and a person turns into a monster. Dr. Frankenstein's need for knowledge turns him into the kind of person who creates a monster. Dr. Jekyll also values his desire for information above all else and creates Mr. Hyde. In another kind of horror story, the threat to the central character or characters comes from the outside. An outside force may invade the character and then force the evil outside again. The vampire attacks the victim, but then the victim becomes a vampire and attacks others. Stories of ghosts or demonic possession also fall into this category. Okay, so here, once again, she's using criteria, standards used to define and classify literature. And she's saying that one way of categorizing horror stories is by the source of the horror. Does the horror come from inside the character. Remember when we read The Telltale Heart? That horror was coming from inside him because he was crazy. He was mad. And so in his mind, he was hearing that beating heart of the man that he murdered. On the other hand, in The Monkey's Paw, there was a real supernatural element. The monkey's paw itself did have a power. In this case, the people who were sane did not believe in its power, but it turned out to have a power, and a very evil power at that. He uses examples of Dr. Frankenstein, who invented Frankenstein's monster, and Dr. Jekyll, who makes a potion so that he can become Mr. Hyde, who ends up being an evil man, like an evil twin of his. And so all of these are examples of how horror comes from different sources. And sometimes it's the source of the horror that defines the work. So last paragraph here. We also look at the kinds of themes common to horror. Many works concentrate on the conflict between good and evil. Works about the fantastic may deal with the search for forbidden knowledge that appears in much horror literature. Such quests are used as a way of examining our attitude toward knowledge. While society may believe that new knowledge is always good, the horror genre may question this assumption, examining how such advances affect the individual and society. All right, so that's the essay. There's questions that you need to answer for this essay, and they're attached to this assignment on Google Classroom. Now, don't forget to hit like and subscribe and to turn on your notifications so you can see all my wonderful videos, because it's never a horror when Mr. Wells shares good books with you. Have a great day.